Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this morning regarding financial wellness, budget planning, best practices. I am Stuart Ellis. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Charter School Capital and excited to be with you all this morning. And more importantly, I'm very happy to have with me Spencer Stiles and Bonnie Benson, two of the most revered experts in the charter school management space, and excited to be here today with them to share some of their expertise and learnings with all of you. Spencer and Bonnie, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
This morning we have attendees from across the state of California who have joined to listen to you guys espouse all your wisdom upon them. And with that, I'll just say, why don't I have each of you talk about a little bit your background. Bonnie, if you can share with everybody your background before, during, etc. at the Fortune School, that'd be great.
Absolutely. So my technical background is I actually have an accounting degree and earned my CPA after graduating from college. And I started out my career in school finance, actually working as an accounting manager in a traditional school district. And after a little bit over a year, had my first child and started doing consulting, and spent the next probably 18 years or so consulting for both traditional school districts as well as charter schools in the Northern California area. During that whole time, Fortune School of Education was one of my clients. I've been doing their accounting ever since they started as a corporation. And they, about 8 years ago, started going into the charter school space. And I came on board full-time as their Chief Financial Officer. And as you can see from the slide deck, we have been opening a school a year almost every year since we started. We are have just opened our 7th school. One is in San Bernardino, the other 7 are in Sacramento, or the other 6 are in Sacramento. And our newest school is actually an early college high school where the students will not only earn their high school diploma, but they, at the end of 4 years, will also have their AA degree. And that's me.
Awesome. Spencer?
Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. My name is Spencer Stiles. In terms of personal background, I started my career in public accounting as an auditor and ended up assigned to the Alliance College Ready Public Schools as their auditor a number of years ago, back when they were quite small, and ended up leaving public accounting to take over their finance and accounting department. At the time, there was only 9 to 10 schools, and I was involved in managing their growth all the way to 24. At that point, I had left the Alliance and moved over to Charter Impact to provide the same kind of financial management and oversight for independent charter schools. Charter Impact is a business management firm specializing in charter schools and nonprofit organizations. And so essentially what we do is handle all of the transactions and responsibilities that you would expect from an internal accounting department from the CFO level down. So that includes things like budgeting, forecasting, facility financing support, all the way down to record keeping, managing relationships with auditors, processing payroll, invoices, compliance reporting, and basically the whole gamut.
Well, your services are welcome across the state by many of your clients, and I think for both of you, I know the audience today is excited to hear from you. I should say, as the things we're going to cover today, we're going to look at stages of growth for charter schools, the financial challenges faced by you as operators, and budget planning best practices and takeaways in thinking about managing your institutions. We've had a lot of discussions on this over the years, but I think the perspectives of the two leaders that we have with us today are going to be really new and interesting. That said, by way of background, just for me, Charter School Capital as an organization has been serving charter schools now for a decade. We are, the end of this year, we'll celebrate the end of our 10th year, and we've supported now nearly 600 charter schools across the country. We have funded and invested well over $1.5 billion in those schools. And as of this fall, we will have supported over 800,000 students across the country. It is exciting and inspiring for us to be doing this, and connecting with leaders like Bonnie and Spencer are our privilege in assisting and supporting all of you out there. So with that, a reminder as we go through this, you don't need to do screenshots or anything like that. You're welcome to if you want, but the entire presentation and the recording will be available afterwards today at charterschoolcapital.org/webinars. You can select the most current one or see and download others that we've done in the past. But so don't worry about memorizing everything or taking screenshots of everything. It'll all be there for you afterwards. And with that, let me talk a little bit about, just the environment that you all operate in, which is when you think about the charter schools as an institution or your organization, we think about this as kind of three phases. And of course, in your growth cycle, the startup phase, is really just getting the organization off the ground, opening your school, getting started, and that period has very different strategies associated with the early stage of development of your organization, and that lasts from year 0 when you get your charter to, depending on how the dynamics are of your school, years 2 to 3. Somewhere in there, you will then, if you're successful at surviving the startup phase, which is exceedingly challenging, if you survive the startup phase, you get into this area or opportunity that we're referring as growth, or the high growth phase, where really your organization will feel a lot like a teenager going through, adolescence and puberty. At the beginning of the period, you're smaller and less developed, and at the end of the period, which is very rapid, just a couple of years typically, you are fully grown and much more developed. That said, around year 5 or so, you're at about max capacity for the students you are planning on serving, and you end in a phase that we refer to as sustainable maturity, which, as you'll hear from the panel today, is not just sitting on your rocking chair on the porch, riding out, the rest of your life. There are a lot of different dynamics there and opportunities for continued growth and expansion or other things depending on what you do. But the strategies in those phases, figuring out how, in the high growth phase, you do things flexibly, and then during your mature phase, being as efficient as possible so you can invest more funds and resources back into making the program better and better over time. So those are the kind of phases that schools face. If you think about what causes a charter school to fail, the study now 5 years ago by the Center for Education Reform, but still very relevant and the best survey we've seen in the industry, says these are the reasons for charter school closures. Now, along with this, there was a statement when I mentioned the thing about survival during the startup phase, a statement that of the charter schools that fail in the country, 87% of them fail in the first 3 years. If you make it out of year 3, past infant death, you tend to have an opportunity to flourish and grow. So that period is very difficult. But the reason schools fail, that 87% or the others, is listed here. And you can see that the largest section, 42%, fail due to financial issues. You just run out of cash and you can't make it. 24% due to a category called mismanagement, which in the end really amounts to usually financial. Reason for that is if you mismanage things, usually the school closes because it ran out of money. That said, you've got about 2/3 related to running out of funds. The others, as you go across, academic failure tends to get much more headlines but only 1 in 5 schools actually fail because they're not performing academically. And then it gets smaller and smaller as you go across. You can see authorizer politics or obstacles, 5% for facilities issues, which is a huge issue, usually constraining growth for schools, but not typically resulting in their death, and 4% for others. So with that, as you think about it, we've kind of tried to summarize, and condense down to a single page the different approaches at varying stages. And we're going to go really deep into this with Bonnie and Spencer talking about their perspectives on each of these phases. But I think at a high level, if you look across this chart, you see 3 stages: startup, growth, and sustainability, and then 5 categories of things people consider: financing, facilities challenges, community involvement, academic accountability, and operational support. It's important to note that there are other issues, but most of what we're going to focus on in today's webinar is around the financial issues. Not just financing, but the challenges of managing your budget and the constraints of how much funding you have coming in from a revenue standpoint or a financing standpoint, and then how you manage the expenses and expenditures of your organization to really maximize the opportunity to deliver against the school's mission of serving children with higher quality education. The other things are relevant, and they're on here just as note. And you can see the changes. At startup for facilities, you just want to get any old building you can that's hopefully in the target location that you want to serve, so that when you grow and expand, you don't move to a place that's outside of the area of the students you're serving. When you get into a growth phase, you're trying to grow and add facilities as you go, not have a 10 times the size space that you have to pay for when you're not fully utilizing it. And then as you get out to the sustainable period, then you can have a fully developed facility, and you can add things like curb appeal and really look at cost efficiencies and things like that. Looking at the other elements, you can see on here how things change as they go across. Community involvement, just awareness at the beginning, fulfilling the promise once you get out to year 3 to 5 to prove whatever you had promised people when you started, and then long-term becoming part of the fabric of the community. Same thing on accountability for academics. You just get the program going, then you begin to be measured, and you have to prove that it's working, and then focusing on continuous improvement. And Spencer and Bonnie will talk about operational support and how that transitions as we go. Bonnie and Spencer, any comments on this before we drop into the detail that you guys are going to cover?
Yeah, I think one perspective I would give as well for newer charter school leaders is that a lot of times folks that are either the lead petitioners or the founders for the school come from an educational background, and therefore typically have a pretty good perspective and understanding on the kind of birth and growth and life cycle of an instructional program, and have a vision on how to create and ensure community involvement. But I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize that even your financial structure goes through the various phases as well, and does change over time in the exact same fashion that an instructional program would, as you grow from, let's say, a single class or a single grade level to multiple. Your financial structure, as we'll discuss a little bit later, does go through the same kind of growth and change as the instructional program itself.
I agree with Spencer, and I think too, particularly if any of you are interested in starting a charter school, paying particular attention to the slide where it showed that finances and mismanagement is the largest reasons charters fail. I think it's very true that you might have a visionary leader who has a wonderful idea for an academic program, but they don't really understand the actual business of running a charter school. So it's really important right at the get-go to get somebody on your team, whether it's an in-house internal person who's going to be an employee, or get the services of a company like Spencer's that can help give you that financial expertise, because not only is that the reason that so many charters fail, it's also one of the biggest reasons that authorizers will point to not approve a charter in the first place, because they'll say that you don't meet that criteria of a sound financial plan.
Great. Thanks for adding that stuff. I think that I think another aspect that we discussed before to share with everybody is this point about funding. Both of you are alluding to how you structure financially and look at things. I think that when you look at the programs available across the state of California, for instance, that people can tap into beyond just the revenues coming from the state, but from a funding or financing option, we have this chart shows some of the options available to all schools. And for startup schools, access to grants and fundraising and charitable contributions, which is available to everybody, is a key aspect of what organizations do to get going. In California, the revolving loan from CDE can serve schools during the first 3 years, and I think if I'm not mistaken, guys, it's $250,000. Is that right? Over the first 3 years? Is it still
that sounds right. Yeah.
Okay. And that's available directly from the state at very low costs, but it is a loan. Receivable sales is a program that Charter School Capital is engaged in over the years. There are other organizations out there now doing some of that, but our receivable sales program is available at all phases, startup growth and maturity. Long-term leases are a way to finance now facilities, 100% financing for schools, again, available at all stages to schools from organizations like ours or developers out there or other institutions who are beginning to invest in the charter school space long-term on the facility side. For startups, lines of credit from a traditional bank or financial institution or the bond market are not typically available, though for the startup of a school that's a replication of a larger CMO or EMO, the bond market sometimes is available to serve those. That said, as you get into the growth phase, a line of credit then becomes something available to schools that have significant financial means and are expanding, and a bank can serve that often. And then those schools that are mature have access to all of these programs, including the bond market if you have a stable organization. The reason that during the growth phase or startup phase, the bond isn't really listed as a primary tool is it's really a lot more expensive transactionally than all of the other programs listed, one. And two, and most importantly, to the extent you're going to expand and grow and change, the bond is a very restrictive vehicle, financial vehicle, that really best serves an organization when it's done growing and expanding. Once you have fully funded your facility and your operations, a bond can be a fantastically efficient tool, particularly for a larger organization. But during the earlier stages where you're going to expand, the restrictions in the bond really constrain the growth of an organization. Bonnie and Spencer, anything else to add on this page?
Not for me at the moment.
Yeah, no, I think you generally covered things.
So another thing to think about is on this chart is this key financial benchmarks. This frames the differences between site-based schools and blended learning models. And while the graphic doesn't look perfect as I'm looking at it on the screen right now and may not appear that way, we'll update it for the final download for you guys. What you see here is for a site-based school, about half of the funds are spent on really teacher salaries, and 2/3 of the money is spent on salaries in general for staff. About 20% in the state of California tends to be spent on rent or your facilities expenses. That could also be debt service, if it's serving a bond or anything like that, but that's facilities expense, and 15% on all other. Now, these are averages for site-based schools. Very different when you look at a blended learning model where there's greater efficiency on the teacher's side, but that's shifted over to the other expenses like the curriculum or online curriculum or what have you, and there's a little bit greater administrative support for staff. And you tend to get efficiencies out of the building also, but you can see how things kind of shift. Before we move into the startup phase, Spencer or Bonnie, anything you'd like to highlight here about the differences in the different models?
Yeah, I have a couple comments on just really the use of the averages. I think in my experience in working with a variety of charter operators and even in a larger CMO type organization, I think the one thing I've learned that's consistent across schools is that every school approaches their budgets and their priorities completely different. And so even of the schools that we're currently working with throughout the state, how folks spend and prioritize their funds varies greatly. So there are some schools who put a high priority on teaching and instructional support staff, and you'll see very little spending on things like technology and school supplies and that sort of thing. Others put a much more higher priority on technology and try to gain efficiencies by reducing perhaps admin support, but then you'll see costs increase related to their fixed assets, the infrastructure for the technology, as well as student devices. And so I think the one thing I would point out, while it's good to have the financial benchmarks in the back of your minds, it's also important to point out that how you set up and how you create your financial plan is going to be entirely based on your instructional model. That being said, I do think that the benchmarks have come in handy for us in the past when working with clients when schools are having a difficult time balancing their budget. It's easy to go back and kind of do a comparison to industry averages to see what areas you may be over or underspending based on your individual instructional model. So other than using these as it indicates as just a benchmark, I wouldn't necessarily refer to these percentages as a goal, but more or less an understanding of what an industry average is. And then keeping in mind, again, the financial plan really does need to follow more along the lines of what are the school's priorities and what is needed to really execute the instructional plan.
Great point.
I agree with Spencer as well, and I think for me the takeaway is that not so much what the specific percentages are, but again, in general terms, everybody's model is a little bit different, but the bottom line is that schools really are people businesses. So, in most scenarios, the biggest percent of your budget is going to be spent on people. So that requires, quite a lot of thought about how you're going to deliver your program, because that usually is the biggest chunk of your budget.
Excellent point. All right. Let's go in a little bit deeper into some of the insights and considerations during the startup phase, and we'll kick off with Spencer, if you would.
Great. So in terms of the three different phases we have listed out, the startup phase is definitely and by far the most difficult for new and fledgling organizations. The primary reason for that is because every single area of the organization is scrutinized and does take a lot of focus and energy. And so starting even with the recruitment process and trying to get enrollment up to where the petition targets are takes a lot of time and energy. As a lot of folks may or may not know, the timing on when the state of California actually starts to send out those revenue checks is somewhat peculiar and I think doesn't meet a lot of people's expectations if you haven't seen it before. And so your actual cash balance and your bank balance needs to take a lot of focus and energy. And on top of that, you're also going through the process of really trying to refine and implement the instructional plan that you've documented in your petition, as well as hiring all brand new staff. So it's kind of a perfect storm of trying to get all the various pieces together to ensure you're off to a good start for the organization. That being said, in terms of schools that we work with, there's a couple big things to point out, and it seems fairly consistent across the board for new petitioners. And I think the first and one of the most important things that I would point out to folks that maybe don't necessarily have a financial background is that if you're coming from a larger district or a more formalized structure, a lot of new petitioners don't realize that when you start your own charter, you are literally 100% on your own financially. And that's a very different feeling, and it's a very different way of operating when you're used to having the backing of a larger district that allots the budget, as well as a county treasury that really has the cash on hand necessary for you to purchase the items you need. And so as you look on the screen here, one of the first challenges that kind of we go through, and I think that absolutely every single new charter operator goes through, is trying to decipher and determine the difference between needs and wants. And so it's usually a very, very exciting time when you're beginning your first year of operation, your charter's been approved, you're ready to get started. Usually the school leaders as well as their teams are full of energy and have a lot of very high goals and aspirations. And unfortunately, a lot of times the actual financial model and the funding available really puts a limit on what schools can really do during their first few years of operations while you're growing into sustainability. One of the biggest reasons for causing that is actually what most schools use as a slow growth model, adding a single grade level at a time. And so what that means is you typically have a large amount of your fixed expenses, such as a facility or your principals or admin team, office staff. You have the same amount of those kind of fixed costs, but those costs have to be allocated, say, over 100 students during your first year of operations as compared to maybe 500 students at your fully grown, mature phase. And so it's very important to exactly go through what your needs are as opposed to what you want, because typically during, especially your first year of operations, you're really going to be limited to just what you need as opposed to the things that you want to do as you grow into sustainability. Bonnie, is there anything you would want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that, again, getting back to talking about the cash and the source of funding streams, one thing that I think people find surprising is that you are going to have expenditures and cash outlay obviously prior to opening your school doors. So then prior to when any of your funding streams come from the state. For example, it says on here you have to find a suitable facility. Well, if you're going to rent someplace, typically when you sign the lease, you're going to be required to pay your first month's rent and your security deposit at the time of lease signing. That's before you've ever opened your doors and before you've ever received any funding at all from your state flows. There are startup grants. For example, they list the PCSGP on the slide as a financing stream, and that is a federal startup grant for charter schools. But that grant operates on a reimbursement basis, so you actually have to spend the money first and then submit claims to get reimbursed. So really having a plan for having some startup cash available is super, super important for brand new schools.
Absolutely. And so, you know, the other thing to keep in mind as well, and it's just to add another bit of responsibility to startup schools, is although, you know, it's already difficult enough going through and trying to figure out what you can afford year one, trying to figure out where you're going to get the cash necessary to start processing payroll, even though your revenue checks don't start showing up for a few months. But really the process of creating that year one budget, as you can see from our final bullet point here in terms of challenges, you really do have to always keep the future financial picture in mind. And so having a plan in place for your first, you know, like a 5-year projection in place is going to be critical to make sure that by the time you get up towards your renewal time frame, you do have the financial history and the financial strength that authorizers are really looking for renewal. In addition to that, looking forward towards the growth and maturity phase, you know, typically startup schools are in a temporary or an incubator facility. And so if you want to be eligible for more permanent financing like a bond or even going toward a kind of a traditional mortgage through a bank, it's important to keep in mind and understand that those financial institutions and investors do want to see historical financial statements going really back as far as they can, and they want all of those annual financial statements to look really good. And so as hard as it is to, I think, really absorb, it adds additional pressure, like I said, on top of trying to figure out where you can slim down your program to really balance the budget, but also important to keep in mind that that balanced budget and that surplus starting in year one does become very, very critical when you get into the later years, because it opens up a lot more doors in terms of financing options.
I think one of the things, Spencer, that you touch on as you go through that and think about that, and that Bonnie, you mentioned with the gap, back here on when money comes in to your organization versus when you have to start spending it, is the challenge of California's funding process. Even with the PennSec being filed, your initial payment, your fiscal year starts July 1, and you've got teachers on site, certainly no later than August. Kids on site, end of August, beginning of September. You're running through things. The first payment that a startup school gets from the state doesn't arrive typically until October, and some years even later. So you really have no funding at all in that kickoff phase unless you arrange some form of financing or you have contributions to get there, or can get vendors and really the team, even the staff, to work with you in the initial stages.
Yes. I think that, to me, I think that's actually probably the most challenging part of getting a new school off the ground.
It's not like when the check comes in, you're suddenly flush with cash either, where you pay off everybody who's done you a favor, in the first phase, and then just keep running. Spencer, you want to continue with any best practices or things, or you think you've touched on these?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think in terms of recommendations for people in this phase, starting with that first bullet there, we found that it's typically easier to start with all of the assumptions and all of the inputs that went into the petition budget, as opposed to trying to start from scratch. And the reason I say that is usually the petition writing process and the budget creation process is a very long and very well thought out plan. And so those involved with the charter itself typically have a pretty good gut feeling on what's included, what they can and cannot afford, and all what's in that plan. And so it's a great starting point to then take that and make modifications as necessary depending on a changing environment, whether that be competition for teacher salaries, changing in the state funding model, or any of those other adjustments. But I really think from what I've seen and in my experience, schools are far more successful at really knowing and understanding their year one budget if they start with what was done with the petition and then modify it accordingly. A couple other things which I think have been helpful tips, at least for us in working with new petitioners and startup schools, is that when going through the budget creation process for your first year, and really for every year during this growth phase, it's typically easiest to add all of the expenses that you can think of. So, I talked in a little bit of depth on the last slide about trying to decipher and separate needs versus wants. But in terms of a practical budget creation process, I've always found it to be easier to include absolutely everything for the first draft. So you'll include all of the wants, everything that you can think of, all of the support materials and support staff that you think your teachers are going to need. And what you're going to be left with at the end of that first draft process is a massive deficit. However, it gives kind of the full layout of everything that everybody would want. It gets it down on paper. It gives you a starting point to then go back into and look at what are the individual areas that maybe we can do without in year 1 and 2, but we need to add in year 3. What is another area where this would be nice in a more mature phase. However, I think we'll be able to get by this year without it. And so by including all of those wants and all those expenses that you can think of as a starting point, everybody involved with the budgeting process will have a much better and deeper understanding of what the school can and can't afford, because they will have participated in actually the debate and the prioritization of what can the school afford, and we're also present and very conscious of the fact of things that are being removed from that first draft in order to get to a balanced budget. And so the flip side to that is if you really try to start slim and don't really map out everything that you may want or that you may need when it comes up, school leaders are often left with a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainty during the really during the middle of the year in the first year and maybe year 2 and year 3, because teachers will pose questions or other administrators will ask if you can afford this or that and ask about technology. And it's really hard to then be able to conceptualize what you can and cannot add or move around in the budget if you haven't already gone through that process from the start. And so I think having that sort of system in place really helps people who, again, may not be accountants, they may not have a financial background, but they'll have a much better feeling as to where their organization is financially and what they can and cannot afford.
And I think what I'd like to add to that is you also have to realize that your budget is sort of a living, breathing document. As an accountant, I like nothing more than checking something off my box and saying it's done. I love closing the books because I say it's really done. It's finished. Your budget isn't really like that, though, because you build the budget based on assumptions. And you then have to test those assumptions throughout the year and make sure that they are holding true. For example, you will project what you think your enrollment and therefore your ADA is going to be, and your revenue is based on that. Well, you have to be monitoring and watching that enrollment and that ADA constantly to see if you're actually going to make that budget target. And if you're not, you have to be flexible and you have to maybe make adjustments mid-year to course correct for that. So it's something that once you say I've built my budget for the year, you don't just get to put it aside. You have to constantly be looking at those assumptions and making sure that everything's holding true.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I agree with that, and I'd say as an individual who's run a number of companies throughout my career, I remember the first business plan I put forth for funding of a startup organization. And the person who made the first investment, who became my chairman of the board, read the business plan and sat down for our first potential investor meeting and said, I read your business plan, it was very impressive, and it is wrong. And I looked at him and I said, why are we meeting? Why did you take the time to meet? And he says, well, really every plan, every budget, everything that projects the future is wrong. I have no idea where it's wrong, but I know it's wrong. And he said he ended up investing because he said that the thoughtfulness of laying out what may or may not happen and how we would address it actually was enough for him to have confidence. So I think the comment about assumptions and then seeing how they come to pass, you have to react to those. You're constantly revising the budget. I think that holds true in any institution, anything that's driven by funds in and funds out. Well, if there's nothing more on startup, why don't we transition to the growth phase? And to kick that off, on the screen now, you can all see a 4-panel picture that we refer to as the Charter School Growth Estimator. And what this is attempting to capture is the financial impact or potential financial impact of growth on any organization. And we at Charter School Capital use this tool for clients that we serve and tools, and the team here has access to this tool. But I think anybody can do these kinds of analysis where you start out and say, given where we're at, how much will it cost us to expand, and how much value, at least economically, will be created by that for us to reinvest in the program or build the strength of the organization. So what you see here is you see 4 panels. I'm going to walk through them relatively quickly. In the upper left-hand quadrant, you see the dynamics or the specific statistics around the school. So this school is a school named Very Cool Charter School in California. It's a site-based school. The same model could apply. We have mechanisms to adjust for site-based, blended learning, or online. And I think that as was mentioned earlier when Spencer and Bonnie were talking about the benchmarks, this utilizes averages and benchmarks, but you can put in the specific elements and numbers for your own school. And here for this school, you have a base school with 400 students currently enrolled. The capacity of the facility they're in holds 575. You can see the ADA, their yield, and their student-teacher ratio, which drives how much staffing you have to have as you expand. And then there's a figure in there for student recruitment cost, which is important to keep in mind because kids just don't show up on their own. You're investing something, whether it's in PR or parents and teachers and in a local community trying to recruit kids, or formal marketing efforts and advertising campaigns. Whatever that is, this, and it's going to be different for every school, but this $700 per student kind of cost of recruiting is a good benchmark to run by. In the lower left-hand quadrant, you can see what things look like. In the left-hand column where it says 0%, we've broken down the revenues for the school as it currently stands with the 400 enrolled, the expenses being already currently invested by the school in teacher salaries of just under $2 million, classified and admin staff, rent, capital items, etc. And you can see total expenses of about $3.8 million, which has the organization running at break even. Then we run 3 scenarios. If you grew 10%, which would add about 40 students. If you grew 25%, or about 100 kids. If you grew 50%, or 200 kids. And the key when you get up to 50% is you'll note that at 594 students, that's more than the facility will hold. So you have to invest in expanding the capacity of the facility. Down below, you can see how those scenarios run through. What happens to my additional revenue? It grows from 3.8 million to 4.2 or 4.8 or 5.7, depending on the scenario. And down below, you see the expenses given maintenance of the existing benchmarks and staff, but you do get some spreading and economic efficiencies associated with the expansion. Down below, there are 2 additional lines, incremental recruiting costs and incremental facilities expenditures, and you can see what that costs on an annual basis in each of these 3 scenarios. And then finally, down below, in blue, you can see 2 numbers, or 2 rows, the gross capital required and the discretionary surplus, which is the excess created. So what you see there is on an annual basis, how much money will I be getting in incremental revenues versus the expenses needed to support that, and the school begins to generate a surplus, which is down below. That's the value being created by the growth. However, to get it, given your recruiting costs and any upfront expenditures of the facility's expansion, in each scenario you can see how much financing, capital, or reserves you must invest to get there. And for 10% growth, this scenario shows $171,000 of investment. For 25%, it's $560,000. For 50%, it's $1.3 million. Down below, though, those are one-time investments of capital. Down below is the annual impact on the incremental surplus created by the organization, which you could then use to reinvest in academic performance, hire more teachers or staff, gain greater efficiencies, or expand the facility, or recruit more kids, or do whatever you want with those funds. Over on the 2 charts on the right, you can see with the blue line and the gold line on that chart, what you see there is the annual dollars being generated in revenues. The y-axis measures that, and the average daily attendance for each of these scenarios as you run out on the horizontal axis. And you can see that at 400 kids, the school was already operating at break even, but as you expand, the school begins to create that space between the 2 lines is the surplus. And down below is the math for that impact. So for each of the scenarios, you can see the impact in year 1 in terms of surplus, but all the way out to the right-hand side, you can see the 5- and 10-year aspect of each scenario. And what is shown there is that the value of growth to the organization of 50%, even though you had to expand the facility and invest in it, you can see that the 5-year cumulative impact is $4 million of incremental profitability or surplus to the organization that could be reinvested in the program, and at 10 years, it's nearly $8 million. Even the smaller growth figure, though, generates $1 million plus in 5 years, and in 10 years, more than $2 million for just 10% growth. That's something to keep in mind, because most organizations, when they look at it, think, hey, I'm break even, I'm fine. Why would I want to grow and expand? Because I have to borrow money or I have to finance something. That'll create interest costs or expenditures. But the net impact of that capital and its costs are already built into these scenarios. This is the surplus being generated by those programs. You can invest all the way up to that amount in interest expense and financing, and it would still be more valuable to grow. So let me pause there. I know that's somewhat complicated. Anything you guys want to add as we go into, and I know, Bonnie, you're going to lead us through the growth phase. I'll turn to that, but anything you want to add on this analysis, which is, again, just the math?
I think what's important to think about when you're looking at this is that you really need to strongly plan for what your growth is because of the facility implications. So, you know, charter school facilities have unique needs, unique building requirements, and you can't just, you know, if you were working out of a regular commercial office space, you can find office space that's ready to move into fairly quickly. You can't do that with charter schools. Even if you find vacant space, it's not likely going to be set up in a way that's conducive for operating classrooms. So there's tenant improvement work involved and what have you. So you really need to have a very thoughtful plan for your growth and align your facilities to that. You don't want to, in the startup phase we talked about, or in the very beginning we talked about, you know, finding a facility that's in the location that you want to be. It's very disruptive to families to change the school site around. So if the best possible scenario is to find a place that you can be in long term. But Stuart talked about the way that some schools grow is by adding a grade level a year. Well, you need to then think about a facility that can accommodate you at full enrollment, but is there a way that you can negotiate with the landlord to take space over time so that you're not paying for space before you need it? So I think that it's just really important that when you're talking about the growth phase, you always have to really think about it in terms of what also your opportunities and your options are with facilities.
Well, with that, thanks for adding that. I think that's right. And in that model, by the way, that showed that the expansion cost would be about $500,000 of capital invested, which would translate to, in debt service and amortization or lease expense or whatever, an estimated $48,000 a year. So why don't we talk about, and just to highlight for everybody, we have about 15 minutes left for the webinar as scheduled. We may run over a little bit, and again, you can feel free to download the presentation and the full recording if you don't have it all, but I just wanted to highlight that as we go through it. So Bonnie, growth.
Yeah, so I think maybe really what the important thing about the growth phase is, I mean, obviously you can read the bullets on the slide deck, but I think it's taking those practices that you started during the startup phase and really just refining them as you grow. And thinking when you grow, you have to think about not only the things like, well, can our facility grow with us, and what capital needs is it going to take for our facility to accommodate that growth. But then you also need to think about your human capital, because as growth can come in a couple of different ways. Growth can come by taking an existing school site and expanding it and adding grade levels to it. Growth can also come by replicating your schools and having multiple schools. And there are challenges with that, because now you're talking about managing people in different locations, and how are you going to, if you're the back office support, how does that work if you've got people in different places? So I think you have to, when you're talking about growth, you have to think, what kind of growth am I doing? Am I expanding my one school, or am I replicating schools? And then I think too, you have to be true to what your vision and your model is. So I know that, if you are starting to be successful and you're doing really great things for kids and you're starting to get results, then people start coming to you and saying things like, well, we really love what you're doing here in Sacramento. It would be great if you opened a school in the Bay Area. Would you guys consider that? And you really have to think about what direction do you want to take your growth in, because can you manage that? Can you manage something that's a distance operation, and what does that mean for, people resources, money resources, keeping the culture of the school the way that you want it to be, making sure that people that are at a distance aren't kind of starting to do their own thing. So so I think that the best practices here are that you really have to have a solid plan for how you want to grow, and you need to kind of stick to your vision. You want to track your data for your enrollment and for your recruiting. You want to see what kinds of recruiting practices are successful, because you're only going to be able to afford that growth if you actually get the kids in. So being really realistic on your enrollment projections is really, really important. And then, all of these tools about managing your cash, these are things that are important at startup, and they continue to be important as you grow.
Spencer, things to add?
Yeah, I think the one, well, a couple things. I think the first thing that I would highlight here in terms of best practices is the active management of cash flow. And so usually at this point in a school's life cycle, you've kind of gotten the understanding that while you maybe have a balanced budget on an annual basis, when you look at it month by month, there's individual monthly shortfalls, and you have to keep an eye out for when you're making purchases and that sort of thing. I think by the time that organizations get into the growth phase, there needs to be a little bit more of active management and dedication and focus on actual day-by-day cash forecasting. So for example, what we do for all of our clients is we reconcile bank accounts every single week, and we prepare a day-by-day cash flow projection for the next 30 days, mapping out exactly what we expect the bank balance to be every single day, to ensure that things like payroll coming up at the end of the month will have sufficient funds available for processing. And so by doing so, it can help executive directors and CEOs and those in charge of managing the school make decisions on which vendors to pay, which ones to try to hold for a full 30 days, or maybe try to press to a 60-day payment term. But really it gives a lot of visibility into the decision-making process on how to prioritize what you're doing with your cash, without simply looking at, well, I have $100,000 in the bank today, so why can't I use all of it to pay for accounts payable invoices? And so whether or not you're actually reconciling bank accounts or whichever kind of system you're using, I do think by the time schools get into this phase of their life cycle, there does need to be a much more active approach on forecasting their cash balance, and it needs to be a much more closely monitored process.
Excellent points. All right. Sustainable maturity. Bonnie, you want to touch on this, and then we'll, or lead us through this one?
Yes, absolutely. So I think part of the exciting, what's exciting about reaching that maturity phase is that now you really get to focus on maybe some of those wants that we talked about during the startup phase. You have this great vision for your academic plan, and in the beginning, you don't have the economies of scale, you're just getting started, and so you have to just pare down your budget to what the absolute needs are. But as you've grown, now you've added some breathing room to your financial picture, and so now you can really think about what those real wants are with your academic program, and you can start planning for those things in your budget. And we can open schools, but you also have to. What we do, and I think it might be on the next slide, Spencer, is we have a pretty interactive budget process where we work with our stakeholders to really think about where we as an organization want to go. So when we build our budget every year, we start with two things. The first thing is we look at our enrollment projections and what we want to do in terms of growth. Are we planning to open a new school this year? What do we need to set aside for that? But then we also look at what our organizational priorities are going to be for that year. And for us, organizational priorities are things that we can actually accomplish within a one-year time frame. So they're measurable. We try to limit them to 3 to 5 things, and we say that as an organization, this is what we want to win on this year. And then as we build our budget, we have various stakeholders through the LCAP process, through our school sites, our principals, our directors of different departments, all have input into the budget process, and they all provide budget proposals to us. But the way in which we determine what ultimately makes it into the budget is how well do those budget proposals align with what our organizational priorities are for that year. Because there's lots of great things you can do, and everybody's ideas are great, but you can't fit everything into the budget, so you have to have a way to prioritize them. And for us, that's the way that we do it. We do it by tying new initiatives into the budget based on what our organizational priorities are for the year. And one thing that I would like to point out on this slide, and I know Spencer has some ideas and thoughts about this as well, down at the bottom where it talks about single year deficits, how to manage these deficit years when they arise. Fortune has a little bit of a unique perspective. I don't know if it's unique, but we really build our budget on being sustainable based on state and federal revenues. We don't build our budget based on a planned level of charitable support, which is not to say that we don't pursue fundraising opportunities and donation opportunities, but we try to only use funding from that source to pay for one-time type expenditures. For example, startup costs for a new school. And we don't build our operating budget based on charitable support. But there are times when, if you're opening a new school, or maybe you need to invest in some technology or things like that, where you're going to have expenditures that cause your expenses to exceed your revenue for that year. For us, the way that we manage that is, if that is a planned expenditure and it's based on one-time non-reoccurring costs, then we're okay with doing that deficit spending. If it doesn't fit into that bucket, then that means that we need to look at our budget and our regular ongoing operations and make adjustments, because we always want our operational budget to be in balance or creating a surplus.
Spencer?
Yeah, and so I actually had 3 larger takeaways for folks here in terms of best practices. One of them does relate to those single-year deficits as well. And so I agree with everything that Bonnie had to add. I would also point out as well, and having that perspective on why you have a single-year deficit, and was it for a one-time item in nature, I think it's also important to make sure that you know your authorizer's opinion on single-year deficits. And so working with authorizers throughout the state, in our experience, how they react and how they deal with their charters with single-year deficits varies quite a bit. Some of them focus more on the total fund balance, and so as long as you're meeting their requirements in terms of percent of fund balance, they're generally fine with it. Others are much more sensitive and panic much quicker. And so while going through the budgeting process, if it does look like there is going to be a single-year deficit, or you would approach your board requesting a budget that's approved with a deficit, I think it's also very important to stay in touch with the fiscal representatives from your authorizer and make sure you have an understanding from the very beginning on how they're going to react. In addition to that, simply having that conversation ahead of time will also help avoid a lot of trouble later on in the year when the interim reports and the budget report itself, as well as the unaudited actuals, get submitted, because those in charge with governance and oversight from the authorizer perspective are already going to be expecting to see that deficit and already have an understanding of why that's occurring. And the other thing that I would add is and it's a mistake that unfortunately schools make somewhat regularly, but it's important not to depend on future growth in order to fill budget deficit or budget gaps. And so I think there are a lot of schools who will approach a single-year deficit and say, well, we have a deficit this year, but next year, we're going to be adding another 50 students, and so, the financials look fine. I think it's very important to understand that schools have much more control over the expense side of their budget than they do the revenue. And so despite the best efforts of those in charge of recruitment and outreach, it's much harder to actually control what the incoming student population is going to be, as opposed to where you're putting funds and how you're spending money. The other two areas that I would just add as well, especially in this phase, have to do with vendor maintenance as well as cash reserves. And so starting with vendor maintenance, typically schools in their startup and growth phases are kind of trying to figure out where they can get vendors, where they can get the services they need. They're worrying more about their cash flow needs during the first or the upcoming week or upcoming month. And I think a lot of them lose the vision that by the time you get to a larger and more mature phase, you do actually start to build a certain amount of purchasing power and therefore have a bit of muscle that you can flex with your vendors. And so what we always recommend is setting up standard terms with your vendors. And so, whether that's a payment in net 30 days, which is kind of a standard in just about any industry, depending on your cash flow needs and depending on the dependency your vendors have on you as a customer, you might be able to put some pressure on those relationships and extend those payment terms out to perhaps a net 45 or net 60, helping your cash flow needs in just using that in itself. The other idea to keep in mind as well is the use of purchase orders. And so it's an additional process that some schools implement based on an internal control requirement, but it also can be a useful tool in terms of managing cash flow. There are many organizations that will accept either payment up front or deposits or the use of a debit card, but will also accept a purchase order. And so by using those POs in a more robust PO system, it allows you to, again, keep your cash in your bank account for longer, waiting for that state revenue payment to catch up. In terms of cash reserve as well, I think the one thing that I think everybody just needs to face is that at some point state funding is going to go back down. Looking back a few years ago when the state was deferring up to 37% of its payments, that's a huge impact. And while I think schools over the last 5 years or so have seen a very positive and optimistic environment in terms of the implementation of LCFF, growing funding levels on a per pupil basis, it really is just a matter of time on when that turn is going to come. And so schools, once they reach that mature phase and they've gotten to the point where you're kind of steady in terms of your enrollment and you have much more predictability in terms of what your program is going to look like, it's important for individual school boards to actually set a target cash reserve level. And so most authorizers focus on fund balance. And while fund balance can be a useful tool in looking at financial health of an organization. You can't pay your employees out of your fund balance, and you can't buy equipment out of your fund balance. You literally need cash in the bank to make those things happen. And so it's important for an organization, both the leadership as well as the board, to really have a thorough conversation on where they feel cash reserves should be set. And so during that mature phase, budgets can be prepared and financials can be managed accordingly to grow to that kind of board dictated or board decide cash reserve. So in doing so, it helps you as well not only prepare for that inevitable economic downturn, but also in the mature phase, schools are typically in permanent facilities. So you need to be prepared for upcoming maintenance, potential roof repair, and major things like that, in addition to keeping an eye on ever-evolving technology needs. And so I think everyone would agree that if you look 10 years ago, no one would necessarily have the perspective on how widely technology is currently being used. And so while none of us really know how that's going to evolve 10 years from now, it definitely does a school a lot of benefit to start planning for that unknown. So when new technology and new opportunities arise, you have the resources available to really implement that to best serve your students.
Well, I think some of the things touched on here also highlight that to the extent necessary or supporting growth, expansion, or reinvestment, one-time investment, financing tools in the market can also be useful to address some of these issues and ensure that you have reserves and a fund balance at year end, regardless of what happened from a deficit or surplus standpoint during an individual year. That said, I think the same point that's being made across the managing conservatively the expenses, because you don't really control revenues that well, certainly until the kids are actually attending your school. You can't project that future. Similarly, using financing to provide one-time boost to the organization or long-term or interim growth is valuable, but using it to long-term sustain a continuous deficit is not something that works, right? Financing a continuous deficit results in increasing that deficit rather than going the other way. Certainly you could use it to deal with some short-term crisis or deficit, but I think it's important to keep in mind that even using tools like financing also are things that have to be done consistent with a solid long-term strategy and year-over-year strategy that ensures that the amount of income coming into the school in terms of revenues is at least as much as the expenses and expenditures you're going to have to support the organization. So with all that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. Again, a reminder that you can download the webinar today and the recording at charterschoolcapital.org/revenues. We've addressed questions as they've come along throughout, and I think hopefully everybody had their information covered. To the extent the requests or follow-up questions, or you just want to access any of the three of us, contact information is here for the panelists today. And I really wanted to thank Spencer and Bonnie for joining us. It's a privilege and an honor to be with the two of you today. I really appreciate your expertise. I know the schools in California do. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
And with that, we'll end today's webinar. Thanks again to everybody, and we look forward to working with you all in the future.